All right, so today we are happy to have Robin Zhao here with us. So Robin is an assistant professor at the Department of Civil Engineering at McMaster University. And his background is in civil and environmental engineering, specializing in multi-phase flow in porous media with applications to low carbon energy systems. He earned his PhD from MIT, where he worked on fluid mechanics, geological carbon sequestration, and he also did a postdoc at the University of Toronto after that. And now he is at McMaster, and his team specializes in studying multi-phase flow through porous materials, and their primary weapon is visualization. I saw this on your website, and I absolutely agree. And there's a lot of the work that Robin and his team has done that connects very much with the things that we are interested in here in the PoreLab in New York. So I'm sure you're going to see that. So Robin, if you can go ahead, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you, Marcel. Hi, everyone. I'm Robin Zhao from McMaster University. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today. So I'd like to thank the organizers, Marcel, Yao, and Joanne for inviting me. I have personally learned a lot from the excellent talks on the PoreLab YouTube website. So I'm happy to be contributing today. So the title of my talk today is Pattern Formation in Fluid Displacement through Simple Porous Media. And before I start my talk, I thought I would tell you just a little bit about McMaster University. So McMaster is a public research university located in Hamilton, and that's in the province of Ontario. So we look at a map of North America. So Hamilton, where McMaster is located, is in the southeast, close to Toronto. So if we zoom in to that area a little bit, we find that McMaster is around 40 minutes away from Toronto. And if we go east from McMaster, then we can reach Buffalo, New York in about an hour. Or if we go west, then we can get to Detroit, Michigan in about two hours of driving. Okay, so this is a picture of how our campus would look like now. And then I'm going to show you a picture of what our campus looks like 3 weeks ago. This is nothing new to our Norwegian friends, but we here also get the 4 seasons. Okay, so this is all I want to say about McMaster. And now let's get on with the talk. So I'd like to tell you 2 stories today. So I was looking at my slides. I think I might have been a little bit ambitious. We'll see how much we can get through. The first story is single phase flow problem with reaction and precipitation. And the second story is a multi-phase flow problem through a porous media with mixed wettability. So the title of the first story is Fingering Instability During Mixing-Driven Precipitation Flow. So this work was led by my PhD student, Nagar Shastavar, and also in collaboration with Ruby Fu from Caltech. So we know that reactive flow in porous media that involve solid precipitation and deposition is a common phenomenon in many processes. For example, this happens in geological CO2 sequestration. And this is especially the case when we inject CO2 into a very reactive formation like a basaltic rock. And in that case, what people have found is that we achieve fast mineralization due to reaction between CO2 and the dissolved minerals. So in these micro CT images on the bottom left here, we can clearly see these white nodules, which are the mineralizations that deposited in the pore space after CO2 had been injected into a basaltic core. And in the civil engineering field, people have known for a long time that the dissolved lime can react with CO2 in the air and form a calcite precipitation front. So we know that solid precipitation can decrease the permeability and porosity of the porous media, which could lead to significant decreased injectivity. So this provides the motivation for trying to understand these problems a little bit better. So personally, I think Hele-Shaw cells are a great tool to study different problems in porous media, and I think PoreLab would agree. And I would say the reason for using Hele-Shaw cell to study this problem in particular is that we can directly visualize the complex interaction between flow, reaction, and precipitation. And another advantage is that we can use the experimental results to directly compare with high-resolution mathematical modeling to validate our numerical models. So there have been a few really nice studies looking at precipitation flow in Hele-Shaw cells. So on the bottom left here, showing a study by Nagatsu et al. So it was published in PRL in 2014, where they looked at potassium ferrocyanide precipitation in a radial Hele-Shaw cell. And similarly, Schuster et al. So these are the images on the right. They studied calcium carbonate precipitation in, again, radial Hele-Shaw cell geometry. So what we wanted to do is very much in a similar vein. So we studied reactive flow dynamics of calcium carbonate precipitation in a radial Hele-Shaw cell. And the gap thickness of our Hele-Shaw cell is 100 microns. And the Hele-Shaw cell is initially saturated with a calcium chloride solution. What we do is we inject sodium carbonate from the center of the Hele-Shaw cell to displace the calcium chloride. And the reaction between the two solutions is going to produce calcium carbonate as a precipitate. So in our experiments, we varied the injection rate Q from 0.1 milliliter per minute to 5 milliliter per minute. And we changed the initial reactant concentration, C naught, from 0.5 mole per liter to 1 mole per liter. And we use a CMOS camera to visualize our experiments in high resolution. So the camera is going to capture the change in light intensity as a result of the precipitation of the particles. This is the experimental phase diagram that we obtained. So the y-axis, the phase diagram, is showing the initial concentration from going from bottom to top. We're increasing the initial concentration of the reactants. And the x-axis here is showing the injection rate going from left to right. We're increasing the injection rate. So in all of the experiments, we observe a radial precipitation band. So this is at the interface between the injected fluid and the defending fluid. In general, we see that if we increase the initial concentration of the reactants, then we observe a higher gap average concentration of the precipitates. So one thing that I forgot to mention is that the color bar here shows the gap average concentration of the precipitates. So we have a darker color, that means there's less amount of precipitates across the gap. And if we have a bright color, that means there's more precipitates across the gap. Okay, so to take a look at these experiments in a little bit more detail, I'm going to play two movies. The first movie is for the precipitation at a low injection rate. In this case, we observe the formation of precipitates that are smaller than the typical pixel size in our experiments. And these precipitates are deposited uniformly over the Hele-Shaw cell as the precipitation front expands radially outward. But at the high injection rate, however, we find the formation of larger precipitate aggregates that form and deposit in the Hele-Shaw cell as discrete clusters along the radially outward direction. And if we look at the intensity of these clusters, we find that their color is much brighter, which means that there's much more precipitates across the gap compared to the low injection rate experiments. So another thing.
Okay.
Yes, Marcel.
So here, like the fluid that you are injecting, is it viscously stable?
Okay, yeah, great question. So I should have mentioned this. So the two fluids that we inject, they are viscously stable in the sense that they have the same viscosity. So the sodium carbonate solution and the calcium chloride solution have the same viscosity. So I think Marcel brought up a very interesting observation. So we clearly see some viscous fingering instability in our system, even though the injected fluid and the defending fluid have the same viscosity. So why is that? And so that leads nicely to my second slide. So if we look at the evolution of the experiment, we can clearly see these viscous fingering instability that evolves in time. And this is the reason why we have deposition of these precipitates along the radially outward direction, and that's because these precipitates are formed at the finger-finger boundary. So to answer the question of why do we have this viscous fingering instability when we have two viscosity matched fluids, and the reason for that is exactly because we had the formation of these precipitate particles. So it is well known that particle enrichment at the free surface of suspension flow can lead to viscous fingering instability, and this is because of the lower mobility of the particle containing suspension. So I'm showing here two very nice experiments, both published in PRL. So the first one is conducted by Tang et al. So in their experiment, they injected a PDMS oil that is dispersed with polystyrene particles into a Hele shell cell that has PDMS oil and a Hele shell cell. And they find that the enrichment of these particles at the interface lead to this very nice viscous fingering instability. And similarly, more recently, Kim et al. Did a similar experiment where they injected silicone oil dispersed with polyethylene particles into a Hele shell cell with silicone oil. And they again observed these viscous fingering instability due to the concentration of the particles at the free interface. So we think this is exactly what happens in our experiments, and the key difference being that the particles in our experiments are formed at the front where the two fluids meet due to precipitation. So we say that the active generation of particles at the precipitation front can trigger viscous fingering instability at high injection rate. So why is it that we observe them at the high injection rate experiments? We think there are two reasons. And the first reason is that at high injection rate, we have high hydrodynamic shear force. And this shear force helps the precipitate particles to overcome the interparticle repulsion force and allow them to aggregate and form larger particles. And these larger particles then decreases the mobility of the suspension, and that triggers the viscous fingering instability. And the second reason is just that high displacement velocity naturally accentuates the viscous fingering instability. That answer your question, Marcel?
Yep, thank you.
Okay. Okay. So in addition to the difference in precipitation patterns, we find is that viscous fingering also have a very strong impact on the rate of precipitation generation in our Hele shell cell. So what I'm showing here are the normalized intensity on the y-axis. So this is an indication of how much precipitation we have in our flow cell. On the x-axis, I'm showing the dimensionless time. And this is for three different injection rates. And we find that at low injection rate, so this is the left bottom figure here, the amount of precipitation grows diffusively in time. So we see this nice T to the 1/2 behavior. And at high injection rate, so this is the figure on the very far right, see the amount of precipitation grows linearly in time. But at the intermediate injection rate, so that corresponds to the middle figure here, we saw that the amount of precipitation grows linearly at early times, but then it slows down and starts to evolve diffusively at late times. And this change in scaling corresponds to shutdown in fingering behavior. So we see here that clearly viscous fingering has a strong control over the rate of precipitation generation. And our hypothesis is that the enhanced precipitation in the presence of fingering is due to this recirculatory flow in the interior of the fingers, which helps bring fresh reactants to the precipitation front. So then we wanted to understand our experiments a little bit better by developing a mathematical model to describe the problem. And the framework that we chose was naturally the advection-diffusion-reaction modeling framework. And there have been a few really nice studies looking at these mathematical modeling framework for this problem. And these existing models assume that the mobility of the suspension decrease exponentially with increasing precipitation concentration, as characterized by the log mobility ratio R. So Nagatsu et al. Performed these simulations in 2014, and more recently, Kim et al. Published a nice paper on this problem in JFM in 2021. So what we think is that these models are a great starting point, but somehow they don't capture the variety of patterns that have been observed in the experiments. And these models also ignore precipitate deposition and the temporal scaling of the total precipitate production is still different from what we observe in the experiments. So we wanted to improve this modeling framework. And we think being able to capture the rheology of the suspension and also deposition is going to be important. So what we did was we included the impact of precipitate concentration as well as the local shear rate on the mobility of the suspension. As I mentioned earlier, the higher shear rate is going to help the precipitate particles aggregate together, which is going to impact the mobility of the suspension. And we also incorporated particle deposition on the top and bottom surfaces, the Hele shell cell. And we also account for the corresponding impact on the local porosity and permeability. So this is our mathematical framework, which I won't talk about other than to say that the model that we developed is controlled by three key dimensionless parameters, which are the Hele number, which controls the relative importance between advection and diffusion, the reaction-diPusionreaction number, which controls the relative importance between reaction and advection, and the deposition-diPusionreaction number, which controls the relative importance between deposition and advection. So the key advancement in our model is that we describe effective viscosity of the precipitate solution as a function of both the local precipitate concentration Cp and the shear rate. And specifically, naturally we'll have increasing effective viscosity with increasing precipitate concentration. And because the local shear rate is going to promote the formation of larger precipitate aggregates, we're going to say that increasing shear rate is also going to increase the effective viscosity of the precipitate suspension. So we model this rheological behavior using a cross model as shown here. And to model deposition, we looked at the existing literature on colloidal deposition. And we find that the rate of deposition is proportional to the concentration of the suspended particles in suspension flow. And we model deposition simply as a modified first-order reaction that is proportional to the precipitate concentration in Cp. And we incorporate a concentration-dependent fractional flow function, which allows us to incorporate an onset precipitate concentration required to initiate deposition. And this is again based on existing experimental evidence of deposition. So I'm going to show some of our preliminary simulation results. So this first one is going to be for the low injection rate. We find that the simulations for the low injection rate experiments is able to reproduce the stable displacement pattern and uniform precipitate deposition. So this is good. And then I'm going to show you a movie of our simulation for the high injection rate. So we see that in this case, our simulation for the high injection rate creates viscous fingering due to the increased effective viscosity of the suspension, as well as the precipitate deposition along the sides of the fingers. If we compare our simulation to the experiments, we find that in the simulations, we do not capture these discrete clusters of precipitation that pinch off. And the reason for that is because we haven't incorporated any surface tension effects due to the presence of the precipitates, and that's why our precipitates do not pinch off. So when we looked at the simulation results on the total precipitate production as a function of time, we see that indeed it also reproduces what we see in the experiments. So on the right here is the amount of precipitate that is produced as a function of time. We see that at low Peclet number, so at low injection rate, the amount of precipitate production grows diffusively as t to the 1/2. And when we increase the Peclet number, or when we increase the injection rate, so this is for Peclet number 5,000, the orange curve, see that it approaches a linear scaling time. So next, we wanted to test the generalizability of our model by simulating the experiments of Schutzer et al., which I mentioned earlier. So they conducted calcium carbonate precipitation in the Hele shell cell with a 500 micron gap. And in their experiments, they also varied the initial reactant concentration ratio. So in our experiments, the concentration of the invading and the defending fluid are the same, but in theirs, they vary the ratio, where the ratio beta is defined as the concentration of calcium chloride divided by the concentration of sodium carbonate. So we see that our model does reasonably well compared to the simulation, to the experiments. And I will just draw your attention to the first row here of both the experiments and the simulations. We find a very interesting pattern, and that in the sense that we have a transition from a space-filling radial precipitation pattern to an irregular hollow tube pattern as we increase beta in the high Dom color number regime. And this transition in the experimental observations seem to be captured by our simulation as well. Okay, so to summarize this part of the talk, we find that simple precipitation flow in Hele shell cell produce a diverse range of patterns, which is controlled by the reactant concentration and the injection rate. And particles in the precipitation band locally reduces the mobility, which leads to viscous fingering stability. And the size of the precipitated particles increases with increasing flow rate due to aggregation. And this is because we have a higher hydrodynamic shear force in these cases, which helps overcome the interparticle repulsion forces. We also find that viscous fingering stability exerts fundamental control over the rate of precipitation, which grows as t to the 1/2 in the absence of fingering, but evolves linearly in time in the presence of fingering. So this work was published last year in a paper in Transporting Porous Media. So in our more recent work on the simulation front, we find that the incorporation of a rheological model that relates the suspension viscosity and precipitate concentration to the shear rate and deposition can help improve the advection-diffusion reaction modeling framework and enables improved prediction of both the precipitation pattern and the precipitation rate observed in the experiments. Okay, so this is the first story that I wanted to talk about. So let's switch gears. The second story I'm going to talk about is on topic of multi-phase flow in mixed wet porous media. So this work was led by my former PhD student, Ashkan Ranazad, also in collaboration with Benzhong Primklov and Ruben Juanes at MIT. So in this case, we define multi-phase flow as the simultaneous flow of immiscible fluids, which don't dissolve in each other and are separated by sharp interfaces. And these interfaces are subject to capillary forces. And when we have multi-phase flow in the presence of a solid, we also need to be concerned about wettability. So wettability is simply defined as the affinity of the fluid to a solid surface. So in the left image here, we have a water that is wetting to the countertop and spreads into a thin film. On the image on the right here, we have water that is non-wetting to the lotus leaf, and the water beats up. And in porous media community, we also define drainage as non-wetting fluid displacing a wetting fluid, and imbibition, which is the case when a wetting fluid displaces a non-wetting fluid. So it is well known that wettability exerts fundamental control over multi-phase flow in porous media, which is very nicely illustrated in this classical experiment by Stokes et al. From 1986. And in their experiment, they vary the wettability of the porous media. So at the top here, we have a porous medium that is wetting to the invading fluid. And the bottom here, we have a porous medium that is non-wetting to the invading fluid. And in this case, we see very clearly that in the case of imbibition, where the porous medium likes the invading fluid, we have a finger width that's much larger than the pore size, whereas in the drainage case, we have a finger width that's on the order of pore size. So this finding was also confirmed in a series of experiments and simulations in the radial geometry. So in these three studies here, the snapshots going from left to right, we have increasing wettability, which means that the porous media increasingly likes the invading fluid going from left to right. In this case, we see that the invasion front becomes more compact. And the reason for this compactness was first explained by Chaplik and Robinson, a pair of classical papers back in 1988 and 1990, where they say this compact displacement is a result of cooperative pore filling at the pore scale. And this happens when two interface arcs overlap on a post or a ring and form a new stable interface. So this is all very good, but we know that all natural porous media are mixed wet in the sense that they have spatially heterogeneous wettability. And when people measure the wettability of real rocks underground, they find that 80% of the carbonate reservoirs have mixed wettability, and this is going to have important implications for CO2 flooding. So recent advances in micro CT allows us to measure contact angle very accurately at the pore scale. And the bottom left image here was showing such experiment for a rock core. And we see that indeed the contact angle changes at a length scale of around, say, 100 microns here, where the color coding indicates the contact angle. So we have changes in contact angle from 40 degrees to 70 degrees in the left image here. And in another study, Al-Hamidi et al. Plotted the probability density function, the contact angle, and they find for 3 different rocks, and they find that indeed there is a wide distribution of contact angles. So we wanted to understand how multi-phase flow occurs in a mixed wet porous media, And the approach that we took was very simplistic. What we did was that instead of having a micro model that have just a uniform wettability, we're going to investigate the mixed wet problem by just introducing one more contact angle into our micro model. So we'll have a porous media that have two different wettabilities. And the way that we achieve this is by making the microfluidic flow cells with a photocurable polymer called NOA81. And this polymer becomes more hydrophilic when exposed to high energy UV light. And we achieve spatially heterogeneous wettabilities by using a UV blocking mask. So the mask has cutouts that allows UV light to pass through. And when using a series of precipitation precision stages in optical microscope, we're able to align the top and bottom pieces of the flow cell with the mask during wettability treatment and also during cell assembly. So we're able to have this micro model that have well-controlled hydrophilic clusters. And we saturate our micromodel initially with a viscous silicone oil, and then we inject water from the center to displace the silicone oil. Okay, so instead of producing just one type of mixed wet flow cell, we produce two. So in both cases, the majority of the micromodel is oil wet, but they have distinct water wet clusters. So on the left, we have a mixed wet micromodel with water wet clusters that have a contact angle of 30 degrees. And on the right, we have a mixed wet micromodel that have water wet clusters that have a contact angle of 60 degrees. So before I play the movie of our experiments, I'd like you to kind of imagine how you think water will percolate through this medium. Okay, I'm going to play the movie. So very interestingly, we see that the invading water preferentially fills the water wet clustering's path in the movie on the left, so in the 120 degree and 30 degree flow cell. And that makes sense because the water wet clusters are hydrophilic and like water. But this is very much not the case in the movie on the right, in the sense that water advances by encircling the weakly water wet clusters with a contact angle of 60 degrees instead of fully saturating them. So we did this experiment for different capillary numbers. And again, we see a similar behavior. So to understand this a little bit better, we studied the evolution of the pore scale fluid-fluid interface by conducting quasi-static simulations of the meniscus using Surface Evolver, which is a program that minimizes the overall surface energy of a fluid-fluid solid system. And when we did the simulations for a mixed wet pore, so and here on the left here, we have a oil wet post. On the right here, we have a water wet post. So in between is our fluid-fluid interface. We find that the fluid-fluid interface at the mixed wet pore takes a S-shaped saddle. And the color here shows its mean curvature. And we find that its mean curvature is close to 0. And of course, the mean curvature is the same everywhere because we're doing a simulation at quasi-equilibrium. So what we can do now is we can simulate the meniscus shape for the typical pore throats in our system. So what I'm showing here is first a simulation of the last stable meniscus in a weakly wet pore throat that is made by 2 posts with contact angle of 60 degrees. And in this case, we find that the mean curvature of the last stable interface is 0.1. But when we did the simulation for a typical mixed wet pore throat that's made of an oil wet post with a contact angle of 20 degrees and a water wet post with a contact angle of 60 degrees, we find, again, this S-shaped saddle that has a mean curvature of 0. So this has a curvature that is lower than what we observe in the water-wet pore throat. And because the capillary pressure is given by the product of surface tension and curvature, the lower curvature in the mixed wet pore throats enables the preferential filling of the mixed wet pore throats in our experiments. So this is not the case when we decrease the contact angle of the water-wet post from 60 degrees to 30 degrees. In this case, we find that the mean curvature of the last stable meniscus in our water-wet pore throat is minus 0.1, whereas the mean curvature of the last stable meniscus in the mixed wet pore throat is 0. So in this case, we find that the water will preferentially invade the water wet post instead of the mixed wet pore throats. And when we took a more zoomed in look at our experiments, we find that we do observe the presence of these S-shaped meniscus in our micro model, which is, again, very reassuring. So next, what we wanted to do is we want to develop a simple pore network model that can reproduce our experimental findings. And the way that we did it is, again, by going back to the classical theory of Chadwick and Robbins, which says that if we capture the different invasion modes of fluid-fluid interface at the pore scale, then we should be able to capture the impact of wettability on multi-phase flow. And specifically, we need to account for burst events, touch events, and overlap events. And more recently, Krylov et al. Extended this framework to incorporate the impact of viscous forces. So now we have a dynamic pore network model for multi-phase flow in simple porous media. So what we did was we wanted to extend that further to include the impact of mixed wettability. And what we did was we started by deriving an in-local solution for the fluid-fluid interface evolution through a mixed wet pore. So the solid line here shows our in-local solution for the meniscus shape, and the circle here shows the surface evolver simulation results, and we find a reasonable agreement between the two. So next, what we did was we wrote down the rules for burst events, touch events, and overlap events through mixed wet pore throats. And that gives us a pore network model that reproduces our experimental observations. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the movie of the simulation results. And what you can see here is that when we have a strongly water-wetting hydrophilic cluster with a contact angle of 30 degrees, the water preferentially fills the hydrophilic clusters. Whereas when we have a weakly water-wet hydrophilic cluster that has a contact angle of 60 degrees, the water encircles these clusters instead of fully saturating them. So this is the phase diagram that we achieved using our pore network model, which again matches our experimental observations quite well. So now that we have this model, what we did was we conducted a series of simulations where we changed the contact angle pair between the water wet post and the oil wet post. So here we chose 30, 120 degrees, 60 degrees, 120 degrees, and 60 degrees, 150 degrees. We also vary the wettability fraction in our system, where the wettability fraction is defined by the number of water wet posts over the number of oil wet posts. So we go from 2% all the way to 98%. We change the capillary numbers as well. So this is the whole phase diagram of displacement patterns that we achieve by running the simulations, which I won't go into too much detail, but I'd like to tell you something interesting that we have found in these simulations. which has to do with the injection pressure. So if we look at the injection pressure of our simulations, it makes sense that at high Capillary numbers, because viscous forces dominate, and the injection pressure is going to decrease monotonically as more of the viscous defending fluid, in this case silicone oil, is displaced. And that's indeed what we see in our simulation results. And when we move to a low Capillary number scenario, we know that capillary forces dominate, and the injection pressure should just reflect the capillary pressure. And this is indeed what we have. So in the case when we have a wettability fraction of 0%, all the posts are oil wet, then we have drainage capillary pressure, which is showing the red line here. And when we have a wettability fraction of 100%, all the posts in our medium is water wet, then we should have a imbibition capillary pressure. And that's, again, what we see. And that's shown in the black line here. But what's interesting is when we go to an intermediate wettability fraction, and in this case, we find that the injection pressure, instead of fluctuating between the drainage capillary pressure and the imbibition capillary pressure, it actually fluctuates between the drainage capillary pressure and some pressure that is much higher than the imbibition capillary pressure. So what's happening here? So what is happening is that because the water preferentially fills the isolated water-wet clusters, it causes the defending fluid, the viscous defending fluid, to redistribute along the invasion front, and that leads to non-negligible viscous pressure loss. And this happens even when we have very low capillary number. So now I'm going to play a movie of the pressure evolution in our system, and you can see that at the invasion front, because the water had to squeeze through these isolated hydrophilic or water-wet clusters, you see a spike in pressure, and that corresponds to the viscous pressure as a result of the redistribution of the viscous defending fluid. Okay, so to summarize this part of my talk, we find a significant amount of oil can be trapped in water-wet clusters during water flooding, and the behavior of fluid-fluid displacement in mixed wet porous media is very sensitive to the contact angle of the water-wet regions. And we also find that the injection pressure fluctuation in mixed wet porous media are modulated by viscous pressure of the defending fluid, even at vanishingly small capillary pressure. So this work was published in a pair of papers. So one of them is in Physical Review Fluids, and the other is in JFM. Okay, that concludes my talk, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Robin. So we open for questions. Any questions from the audience?
Yeah, we have a question here, I think.
Yep.
I actually have two questions. The first one was regarding the first part of your talk,
Okay.
where you looked at the precipitation at the different rates. You have a constant injection